Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Barbara Cole. I'm the artistic director of Just Buffalo Literary Center. And I'm delighted to be joined by Bryan Lee as co-moderator of tonight's event. And I'd also like to thank Megan Stewart, who's serving as program assistant tonight. We are delighted to welcome you to Spoken and Seen, a community conversation with Asian artists and activists featuring Myungmi Kim, Zan Lin, and Mizin Shin. Thanks so much for joining us. And although we are meeting virtually, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are grounded here on the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We wish to honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and acknowledge the treaties that were made on these territories, especially the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which holds that we are to act respectfully to one another and to this land. And though this acknowledgement cannot correct the many wrongs of the far and recent past, at Just Buffalo, we pledge to work toward partnership with a spirit of reconciliation and healing for present and future generations. This spirit of healing guides many of the programs that we organize, such as this evening's panel discussion. It's such a privilege to be in the company of artists and activists who are shaping our community, promoting understanding and respect. And I think many of us have a little bit of Zoom fatigue after a year and a half of doing this. So some of us are going to try to integrate some visuals when we can into the mix, and I will kick that off. So I'm going to share my screen. Sure I am. Here we go. Our goals for this event are to shine a spotlight on the extraordinary artwork and activism of our panelists before opening the conversation to some of the pressing issues and complex questions which inform their work. We encourage everybody to drop questions into the chat at any point during the event. I will introduce our esteemed panelists in just a moment, but first, by way of providing some additional context, I'd like to briefly describe how this event came about. For over 45 years, Just Buffalo Literary Center has brought the world's greatest writers to Buffalo, hosted poetry events and readings, supported the development of young writers, both in schools and at the JBWC, which is our free after-school writing center for teens. We believe in the love of reading, the art of writing, and the power of the literary arts to transform individual lives and communities. We're perhaps best known for our Babel series, which brings 4 of the world's most significant authors here to Western New York each season. After more than a year of sheltering in place, as the world opens back up, this season of Babel draws inspiration from the concept of movement in all its connotations: travel, migration, pathways toward freedom, journeys of self-discovery. In the spring of 2022, we'll feature graphic novelist Alison Bechdel and 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner Colson Whitehead. More immediately, on November 18th, which is just next week, we'll welcome award-winning novelist Chang-Rae Lee. His most recent book, My Year Abroad, examines Western attitudes and Eastern stereotypes, capitalism, global trade, mental health, and the surprising effects of cultural immersion, with both a young American in Asia, a Chinese man in America. Tinged at once with humor and darkness, Vogue describes this novel as a wild ride, a caper, a romance, a Bildungsroman, and something of a satire of how to get filthy rich in rising Asia. They've called it an extraordinary book. It's gotten so many rave reviews. So I would very much encourage you to pick up My Year Abroad. In anticipation of each Babel author's appearance, we organize various community events. So for instance, tomorrow night we're hosting a virtual book discussion, I should say, led by Zan Lin. And spots are still available for that. So you can go to justbuffalo.org to register for the virtual book event or to get your ticket for Chang Ray Lee at Kleinhans Music Hall. And we also offer a simulcast option so people can truly tune in from anywhere around the world. The work that we do at Just Buffalo is grounded in the core belief that books change lives and reading is essential to democracy, unlocking our imaginations and giving us the tools to be free thinkers, to be empathetic citizens who learn through literature to explore cultures different from our own, and in the process, expand our own corner of the world. We understand reading and writing not just as hobbies or a leisurely pastime, but rather as social justice in action. Over the years, Just Buffalo's Babel series has featured numerous Asian writers, including, this is going to be a really fast list, Kiran Desai, Marjane Satrapi, Ha Jin, Maxine Hong Kingston, Amy Tan, Viet Thanh Nguyen, Mohsin Hamid, and Minjin Lee. We've held film screenings and book discussions around their work. Each time, I think we've become more aware of how much more there is to learn for so many about the multitude of cultures and ethnicities which get bracketed under the broad heading of Asian, as well as the history of Asian communities in America, the ongoing challenges with policies as they pertain to immigration, refugees, and asylum seekers. As we witnessed the devastating rise in violence against AAPI communities last spring, we felt a renewed commitment at Just Buffalo to open spaces for these necessary conversations, to raise awareness and foster greater understanding, as well as appreciation for the artists and activists who are working within our own community here in Western New York. For that reason, I was especially thrilled to hear from Bryan Lee, who reached out a few months ago to explore how we might partner on community events, which brings us to tonight. I'm going to let Bryan tell you a little bit more about the powerful work that he's engaged in with NYIC in just a moment. But first, please allow me to introduce our other illustrious panelists. Miyongmi Kim was born in Seoul, Korea. She immigrated with her family to the United States at the age of 9 and was raised in the Midwest. She earned a BA from Oberlin, an MA from Johns Hopkins, and an MFA from the University of Iowa. Her collection of poems under flag won the Multicultural Publishers Exchange Award of Merit. Subsequent collections include Civil Bound, River Antes, Commons, The Bounty, and Dura, which was recently reissued in a special 10th anniversary edition by Nightboat Books. Myung is an avant-garde poet who often employs fragmentary language and uses the white space of the page to explore issues of dislocation, colonization, immigration, loss of her first language, and the fallout of history in her work. She currently teaches in the poetics program at SUNY Buffalo, where she is the James H. McNulty Chair of English. Born and raised in South Korea, Mizin Shin graduated from Hung-Ik University with a BFA in printmaking and received her MFA from UB. Her work has been shown at institutions across the US, as well as in the UK, Spain, and South Korea. Leading numerous printmaking workshops with a number of art organizations, Shin focuses on both traditional and contemporary printmaking practices to promote a multidisciplinary approach to the medium. She's a co-founder of Mirabeau Press in Buffalo, and her work addresses the relationship between process and product, commodity culture, and the art of printmaking against the demand for mass production. Mizin is currently a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Rochester. Zan Lin came to the United States as an 18-year-old to pursue a life different from his native Burma, where he regularly witnessed social injustice and tyranny. In Buffalo, he saw other kinds of injustice and became determined to help. Lin became involved in efforts to ameliorate some of the inequities he saw in his new home, working in various advocacy roles with Push Buffalo, Burmese Community Services, and Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, designing and implementing culturally sensitive community education programs for immigrants and refugees who are affected by toxic chemicals in waterways. In 2017, Lin joined the Community Foundation to support grant programs and manage special projects and initiatives. He serves as board chair for the Partnership for the Public Good and also serves on the boards of the Burmese Community Services and Buffalo Water Festival Committee. He holds his bachelor's in environmental education and policy from UB, his master's in adult education from Buff State, and he's currently pursuing his doctorate in educational culture, society, and policy at UB. And finally, Chen Yang Bryan Lee is the manager of community engagement for Western New York at the New York Immigration Coalition, or NYIC. Previously, he was the curator at El Museo, a nonprofit arts organization in Buffalo focusing on underserved artists and communities. In addition to tirelessly supporting up-and-coming artists, some of the most memorable exhibitions that Bryan curated at El Museo include Shoreline, Remembering a Buffalo Vision. Born and raised in Malaysia, Bryan is a graduate of UB. And it's my great pleasure to turn the mic over to Bryan to share with us more about his work with NYIC. Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you, Barbara, as always, for the beautiful and extremely comprehensive introduction. I will have just some materials to share, so let me get that screen shared. All right. I think that this is going. Can you all see my screen? Oh, okay. So yeah, thank you again, Barbara, for that context, and I'm really happy to be here today, and working with some familiar faces. If you haven't yet already, if you're joining us tonight, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to know who you are, where you're tuning in from. I know that some folks are probably coming from outside Buffalo or Rochester. So I will just talk a little bit about NYIC. So the New York Immigration Coalition is an umbrella policy and advocacy organization that represents 200 immigrant and refugee rights groups throughout New York State. So we envision a New York State that is stronger because all people are welcome, treated fairly, and given the chance to pursue their dreams. Our mission is to unite immigrants, members, and allies so that all New Yorkers can thrive. So a little bit of what NYIC does: we work on advocacy and policy analysis, and we undertake campaigns to promote policies that benefit immigrant New Yorkers and further our goals of equity for all in New York State. We develop immigrant leadership through leadership development programs. We offer training and technical assistance to organizations in our membership. And of course, in my realm of work, we do community education for new Americans in our state. You can find out more about our work at nyic.org, and I will also plug our community resources for immigrant New Yorkers that include our New York State Community Toolkit that provides updates on policy changes and programs that are available to immigrant New Yorkers. So I just want to talk first briefly about the federal campaign that NYIC is currently engaged in around the reconciliation bill that is working its way through Congress, as you may have heard of. So NYIC has joined our national partners in a demand that the Democrats, led by our home state Senator, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, to deliver on their campaign promises to provide a pathway to citizenship for the millions of immigrants that are in our country without permanent legal protection and who contribute to our communities and our economy. You can see here is an action that we did in Buffalo a couple weeks ago in front of Schumer's offices in downtown Buffalo, along with some of our member organizations, Justice for Migrant Families, Refugees Helping Refugees in Rochester, and Access of Western New York. This week, for those of you who are tuning in from downstate or who may have friends and family in downstate, our New York partners are organizing an 11-mile march for the 11 million. That'll be a day-long event on November 12th. So I encourage you to check that out. You know, we know that this country's immigration laws have not been updated since before I was born, right? And we cannot wait any longer. We cannot accept the scraps of the stopgap solution time and time again for our immigrant communities. And so we are calling for the government to do the right thing. So shifting gears a little bit, Asians in New York State, the 2020 census data has just come out this year, and it has revealed an increasingly diverse state, as we all know, kind of anecdotally in our daily lives. So New York State has a population of about 20 million people, and 1 in 10 New York State residents in the last census identified as Asian. From 2010 to 2020, the Asian population increased by 36.3% across New York State. And in Buffalo and Western New York, that picture is, you know, also mirrors the trend. So in addition to kind of longer running demographic trends that we know in the Buffalo region, such as the aging white population and the influx of Asian and multiracial residents in places like Buffalo and Rochester, you know, for the first time in 70 years, Buffalo's population has increased. And this is an eye-popping figure to me. From 2010 to 2020, the Asian population in Western New York increased by 85%. That is a relatively small number, right? So that is still an increase of only about 23,000. But it's the highest rate of all regions in New York State. And, you know, it's a testament to our region being an accessible and welcome destination for a lot of new Americans. And of course, we can always do better, but I think that we've all witnessed and experienced this change as a generally positive one. Now, at the same time, you know, we are remembering that last year is not very far from today. And, you know, with the former President Trump and the response to the coronavirus pandemic, this is, if you follow the news, you may have seen this image from a couple of years ago, or not even a couple of years ago, when he called the virus the Chinese virus, that unleashed, you know, just a torrent of bigotry and anti-Asian hate across the country. And, you know, I bring this up not to just kind of dwell on it, but to remind ourselves that this is a thing that did happen. And this is part of a longer trend of anti-Asian sentiment in the US, you know, all the way going back from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Japanese internment, and even more recent high-profile cases, which I won't go into too much detail, but, you know, I want to kind of, if we look back to 1870, which is when this cartoon titled "Throwing Down the Ladder by Which They Rose" was published in Harper's Weekly magazine. And it depicts European migrants at the time, predominantly German and Irish, who have kind of scaled the wall of the immigration system of the US and have built, this caption says, the Chinese wall around the United States of America, and kicking down the ladder that is labeled immigration. So, you know, we know that this is something that is not new, and this is something that we kind of return to again and again. And so, as Barbara mentioned, you know, I thought that this was really an opportune moment for us to take stock of where we are. You know, looking at this chart, we are here. We are part of this expanding blue rectangle, right? And so we'll obviously hear from a few different kind of perspectives from our panelists, so I won't spoil the presentations for you just yet. Again, as we move into the presentations, we'll have we'll be opening it up for discussion afterwards. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to pop them into the chat. We will try and get to your questions later during the discussion. And with that, I will just wrap up. If you would like to get in touch with me and NYIC, you can do so here. And I will turn this over to Myung, who's going to open us up with a reading. So thanks, and I will stop my share. All right, over to you.
I go to my father's house. I wear a grief hat. I am told to put on coarse hemp and to proceed on my own. Minimum human subsistence experiment deemed not worthy of destroying. Kneeling on the ground, hastily dug, ditches, syringes, hoarding, withholding, designed to starve the whole region into submission. The place I'm from is no longer on any map. Scene, quick pick. Scene, send home money every 4 months. Look out, post. Are these your names? From, we are from, where are you from? To burn or expose to the threat of the sun, a person with a pigeon chest and protruding stomach. At the quarry, leaving the quarry, bringing hand tools, approaching the river. The workmen are prisoners. A chariot is pulled by 2 servants. At the left, heads are counted and the booty is piled in front of clerks who are recording the details in a book and on a scroll. Tablet 6, panel 53. Foundry, mill, warehouse. Tannery, refinery, central clearing hall. Infirmary, barracks, internment camp. Auto plant, containment center, refugee camp. I've been reading to you from my book titled Penury, just excerpts that I thought might somehow join in with the conversation for tonight. This is my cat making an appearance if you hear rustling. And then for the time allotted me as part of this panel, I'd like to then conclude with excerpts from my book titled Civil Bound. And I realized that one of the potential opportunities we have tonight is to talk a little bit about how activism and artistic practices of various sorts, even activism, right, itself can have various expressions and manifestations, or even artistic practices can have different ways of thinking activism. So I'm hoping what I'm choosing to read will help perhaps point some of those pluralities of how we can think of art, how we can think of activism. So to conclude, I'll read from Civil Bound. Arches, vermilion, platform of movable objects for live spectacle. Arch of armaments and charts, a link of people sorted, size, strength, age. Bellflower broth, liver broth, hemispheric lust. Humble rules for eyes and fingers, by arms and legs, by the wallets of tongues taught to make coffins for each other. Finn and aspen grove, persons to appear, persons who made debris architecture. Circumpolar, rifles at the ready, aimed next to distribution of ground corn. Untethered island, bare rigging congregates, pains adoration. Habitation, wooden crates in a nameless territory. Dented objects for gathering water. Plastic footwear, 2 sizes too small. How the cracked heels hang over. The vine suggests sweet potato, but notice the cradle of thorns. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Myung, for that moving and powerful sample of your very powerful work. We're going to turn now to Mizin, who's going to present to us about her work and activism.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Do you see my screen? Awesome. Without my notes, right? That's always I'm concerned whenever I do the Zoom talk. Yeah, Barbara and Bryan, thanks for having me for this event. I feel grateful to be able to share my current campaign, Use Your Voice, Stop Asian Hate, tonight here. The campaign started in response to rising hate crimes as a way to speak out against racially motivated prejudice and violence. The message is being translated into a variety of languages to engage diverse linguistic communities. So far, the prints have been translated into Arabic, Burmese, Chinese, English, French, German, Hungarian, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Russian, Serbian, Slovak, Spanish, Tagalog, Tigrinya, Turkish, and Vietnamese languages. Because all prints are translated by volunteers, there was no specific request for most of these languages. They just came from natural connection to people in these language communities. The only language I actually asked for was Tagalog. I wanted to include it, yeah. So after the Atlanta spa shooting in March this year, I constantly hear, so much news about the big increase in hate crimes against Asians in the US. It depressed me so much. And at a certain point, I really had to stop watching the news because I was getting really depressed and unproductive. At the beginning, like after I watched some videos or news, I read some news, like, I cried in bed. And then my husband actually told me, you probably want to not watch so many news because I was really being very unproductive. Yeah. At the beginning, I started making the prints more for myself and then to encourage myself to speak out against how I felt on social media. I think I was always like the kind of artist that I'm not trying to convince somebody's, to a certain political agenda, but this time I know why, but I felt very strongly that I want to share my voice on social media. So I made this print and I uploaded Instagram. And one of my friends saw my post about, the first embossed prints I made. And then she texted me, asked if she could buy the print for her daughter. And I immediately changed the direction of my prints to a larger scale campaign project. So instead of posting this on social media, if there are people out there who want to buy these prints to show and spread support for their family and friends, I could help them express that support and reach more people. So I made a lot more prints and then more people could contribute their support to more organizations, helping many different AAPI communities in different locations. There are two versions of the prints being made for this campaign. First, blind embossed prints, what you see here. These are being traded in exchange for donations to organizations supporting AAPI communities. And the other second one is a screen prints produced for free public donation, public distribution to raise awareness. Prints have been traded in exchange for over $2,500 in donations so far. And I'm really hoping to raise more money so that I can donate more, especially because I'm an educator. I'm really, I have a very strong feeling about education, and I would like to support the organization where they help for, refugees, students, education purpose. If you have any organization you would like to introduce to me, I would love, feel free to contact me. I will make the donation for other organization, that you support or so. So going back to the Atlanta shooting tragedy, I kept finding increasing rates of crimes based on racism, especially a big change in the rates of crimes against Asians after this happened. Probably now media start paying attention, and then they, try to report more that is relevant to this tragedy news. But the truth is, it has always been going on. It did not just happen suddenly. We just didn't have much of awareness of that. It started happening more and more in public view, but still there is a lack of awarenesses of these issues. So I wanted to screen print the signs and then distribute them to other places where there are big Asian communities like LA, New York City, Vancouver, Toronto, or etc. So I contact, or some other organization actually contact me if they can get the screen prints for their communities. So I mail them and then they put in their, based on their networks there. The engagement through multiple languages helps to invite other members of our local communities to pay attention to these issues, as well as address the idea that just because you're not Asian doesn't mean you cannot talk about these human rights issues. When it comes to racial justice issues, some people misinterpret being a direct victim as a requirement to speak out about hate crimes and racism. Because you're not Asian, you cannot talk about it. I think that's a very misinterpreted idea about social issues. So your awareness and using your voice to speak out on these topics helps other people feel safer in our neighborhoods. So please feel free to share your voice throughout these contexts. I'm doing better these days for sure, but for a while, I was afraid of going outside by myself without my husband. Even, the place that I used to go comfortably, I couldn't go for a while. I asked like my friends or, my husband, can I go with you instead of I go there by myself, I was afraid that there might be no one who would be willing to help me if I were threatened or attacked. Of course, I'm afraid being attacked, or, just in whatever, for just any unsafe reasons. But I think my concern was more like because people would not see me as a part of their community. They will see me as an outsider, and they're not gonna come to me to help, if I'm in danger. That was my main fear. So as an Asian, someone actually that didn't really grow up here. I moved to the state like in my late 20s. And then, whenever I go to a new neighborhood, I sometimes feel like, oh, I don't know if I walk there by myself, or I don't know if I want, I feel like it's a really safe neighborhood. Sometimes like I can't really tell because I didn't grow up here. But if I see a sign sharing public support for Asian or even other minority communities, I do feel a little bit safer, because that sign kind of like tells me, okay, the people who live in this neighborhood understands, and then they want to support other group of people. So that already makes me feel safer. And then, I want to just, I probably will walk there without any fears. So it may not be just me who feels like this. So I think any of the signs that you put on your front yard, I'm sure it will make other people feel different and then safer. So the embossed prints are produced with a blind embossing technique. The plate are laser cut acrylic sheets, and I printed them on printmaking paper without any ink. There is no color in this print. You can't really see exactly what's happening on these prints until you pay attention and then try to move around to read the text better. That kind of motion and practice could be applied to looking at those issues of discrimination and bias in our society. That's the main reason I wanted to make these print in blind embossment. Getting a good view of the whole picture might require adjusting our perspective and moving around a little bit away from our own bubbles to see on other angles. So, when viewers go to my exhibition, they constantly kind of move around to see what's happening. And I want you to have that practice when you look at these social issues. You kind of have to move around. People, actually, if you're familiar with my other work, it might surprise you to see me in front of so much color. And they asked me about the color choice of these screen prints. The truth is that the color for each language does not really have any specific relationship. When making a large number of screen prints for free distribution, to collect a donation, I had to consider my budget, especially during the COVID. We had some cut in our research fund, so I couldn't really spend a lot of my research fund for this campaign to support. So anyway, if you don't consider the budget, you cannot really sustain this project. So I had to use a lot of leftover ink from my university. So all the variety of colors are really randomly choice. They're just accidental choice because I used all the leftover ink, but the intentional aspect of this ink is the way it reflects lights. I mixed the pearlescent ink into all the leftover ink. So using the pearlescent ink for the screen print was done in a similar context to the blind embossment print. So the work invites viewer to change the position. You constantly walk around and you will see the lights kind of change the color of the ink. As you move around the prints, you can experience how it feels a little bit different as your perspective changes. So, and I hope that's something we can all practice in other aspect of our lives, not only just in a gallery. So I've done some of the public workshop. This workshop happened over the summer this year. I collaborated with a student organization called Justice for Asian American Coalition to hold a free public workshop. So participants could print their own signs as well as print and take home a t-shirt. So some people made a sign and some people made the t-shirts, and then I hope they're wearing actually. This workshop was a collaboration of two organizations in Buffalo, Western New York Book Art Center, and then Stitch Buffalo. They designed this workshop together, and then anybody could walk in and then made, their own felt patches that can be attached, maybe their backpack or hats. I'm currently wearing one here. And then some of my students are, they were very actively involved in the social justice issues. So some of them are actually making more of these patches. And then I hope I can sell them and then raise more money. So I feel like these kind of workshops are effective way to frame this kind of artwork, because it invites member of the community and not just member of the art community, but also the larger communities to engage with the social topics, to produce a physical sign of support, and to guide them in just one kind of opportunity to use their voice. So it might just be on one small print or a sign or t-shirts, pin or whatever. The collection and then interaction of a lot of small voices are chance of support and the discussion of meaning and the educational exchanges. So these individual prints and voices are absolutely significant, and not just only for an individual value, but also in construction of a larger context. So yeah, thank you for hearing my voice today. And then I hope something that I mentioned today can help someone else feel more confident and comfortable using their voice too. Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Mizin. I'm going to turn it over now to Lin, who's going to talk about his story.
All right. Good evening once again. I see a lot of familiar faces from the activist and the community building world. So, I really want to give a quick ode. Megan from NYIC, Jennifer Connor, Deja, Dr. Tamara, Elsas, it's amazing people joining us. So we're really in a good company. Now, tonight, I would like to share, what it means to be a Burmese activist in the United States. But before I discuss, I really want to stress the fact that I can only talk about my own activism through the lens of a Burmese political society. And my experience may not reflect the larger Asian activist community or even the entirety of my own Burmese community, because, Burma, also known as Myanmar, is comprised of 136 ethnic groups, more than 300 cities and towns, and over 70,000 villages. So apparently I cannot really speak for all of them. It's just my own lived experiences. So now, what I can tell you today is a unique and complex nature of activism that we engaged as Burmese immigrants in the United States. In my case, I left Burma because, my family and we were persecuted by the military junta of Burma. But my arrival to Buffalo was actually very serendipitous. I was actually going to school at the SUNY Fredonia, town of Fredonia, village of Fredonia. And a friend of mine actually offered me to drive to Niagara Falls. And on our way back, of course, we stopped by in the city of Buffalo because, it's a major city around here, right? And there in the middle of a winter, I actually spotted a couple who were wearing a Burmese costume, Burmese traditional clothing, in the middle of in the dead of a winter. Super cold, but they were still wearing this piece called longji. I was actually very baffled and surprised, and also very happy. So I asked my friend to pull over, and he did, and got out of a car and started talking to them in Burmese, and they responded to me in Burmese. What a joy! So I ended up moving to Buffalo, so when I relocated to Buffalo, I was introduced to organizations such as Push Buffalo, and this is where I reinvigorated my, little activist inside my heart. Through my organizing work, I learned about several structural barriers and social injustices that both new immigrants and other disenfranchised communities, have to face. But here, I also want to note that Western New York, Buffalo in particular, has been very, very welcoming and very, very accommodating. But having said that, we still have lots of challenges and issues that we, as new immigrants and refugees face. These issues became more apparent 4 years ago in 2016 when blatant attacks against immigrants and refugees were mounted. I, along with my fellow Burmese activists in Buffalo, we felt that, we needed to take part in this overall action. We're called to action and we answer the call. I, along with my fellow Burmese activists, we joined these, protests and the No Ban No Wall movement. Alongside Burmese and Nepalis, Bangladeshi and Afghanis and Somalis and Iraqis and we joined our hands and we pushed back and we saw some great successes. We were elated amid fear and uncertainty. We're able to reaffirm our existence in the United States through activism. We knew then that it is very important and very critical for us to remain active and organized, even as new immigrants, and that is our activism in the United States. But I've never imagined that we would ever see a time when activism of Burmese people would be totally linked to a political fate of the United States in much larger context. Fast forward 4 years, right, from 2016, where we stood in solidarity, as the immigrant activist in a Prospect Park. This time we look at our phones and in our TV screens just in horror on the January 6, 2021. We've seen this several times in our life. We've seen this type of thing again and again in our lives. We know what it was. And we bit our nails. We sat on the edges of the seats, chugging countless cups of coffee that night, talking to each other over the phone, FaceTiming and seeing what's going to happen, playing different types of scenarios. We can only sigh in relief when, the results were certified. But still with a guarded optimism, we were still very worried. Now, you may ask, does it have anything to do with the Burmese activism? Well, 3 weeks after that January 6th event, the insurrection on Capitol Hill, a brutal coup took place in Burma. A very, very brutal coup took place in Burma on February 1st. It's almost, as if a green light was given to these wannabe dictators and tyrants all over the world. The same narrative was used by the Burmese military junta. The elections were stolen. The coup was necessary to amend all the wrongdoings of democratically elected government by the people. Because a beacon of democracy was shaken in the United States, and it does send a shockwaves. And these countries and societies with no guardrails, like in the United States, they pay a hefty price. But actually, in fact, some Americans here in the United States, they think that they believe that a coup like that should have happened here in the US. So we're not totally off the hook. It might still happen. So be warned. We all have to be very vigilant about it. So back to our Burmese story, of course, we had to pull our sleeves, reorganize, different activist groups, across Western New York, and we continue our fight against the military dictatorship in Burma, fundraising, networking. We do everything that we could, and we're still doing everything that we could to push back against, the brutal dictatorship in Burma, and it is an ongoing fight. Now, that is what it means to be a Burmese activist. We engage in two-pronged activism. Activism here in our new home and activism in our old home. We've learned that it is crucial to be active in both fronts, as it really impacts our very existence in both worlds. As new Americans, we swear our oath of allegiance to the United States, but we also answer to the call of our native land. But at the end of the day, our activism is of the people who may be vulnerable and weak at some points, but very determined to purge all evils and injustices from both American and Burmese societies. Thank you, and I'm very glad to be here today.
Wow, thank you, Lin and Mizin and Myung. That was a set of really, wide-ranging perspectives, and I hope everyone's joining us has really got a sense of the range of this work. Maybe I can suggest that we can all take a deep breath right now. Shake it out if you've been sitting for too long. We're going to move into a little bit of a conversation after this. And again, if you have any comments or questions, or simply want to say hello, please feel free to put that in the chat. Whew. Okay, so the one thing that we touched upon earlier on is the slipperiness of this term Asian, or that it's both a very imperfect representation of who we are, but also very useful in some ways, in that as Lin mentioned, that it kind of helps us create solidarity and generate this larger identity. And of course, we know that there is a huge diversity of experiences and backgrounds within this label of Asian and Asian American. And I'll just speak, for myself, having grown up in Malaysia, being from a family that was descended from Chinese immigrants to Malaysia, and then being an immigrant in the US myself. Identifying as Asian was something that I actually, had to learn, right? I never thought of myself as Asian before I came to the US. And so I think that's a really maybe an interesting place to start our conversation. To the panelists, I'm just going to put out, what does Asian mean to you? And maybe as a follow-up to that, also, what does Asian American mean to you? And so I'll leave it at that. And does anyone want to go first?
I guess I can share some of my experience. As a someone, again, I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Korea, South Korea, and then moved to the state in the late 20s. So I think same as you, Brian, like I never really thought I'm in the Asian. I'm more like Korean, but Korean is Asian. So I had a several experience that based on the typical, the stereotype of the Asian students. So when I was in program, this is my first time I'm saying this in a public space. There were a couple of people I met at the program thought I came from like a rich family and then doing the study in abroad. And then right now I have a business. Actually, one of my partners into this talk today. Like we opened a print shop after I graduated, and then some people thought some kind of like that weird like relationship that they have in their stereotype mindset, or either I'm from very rich family, so I have money so I can open the business, or second, I'm having an affair with somebody else, something like that. So it's things that I experience, I try to ignore, or I don't really try to pay attention or think about it, but I've experienced enough that people think I'm in the one, they put me in one of the kind of stereotype idea of the Asian international students or Asian young women, that I think it really bothers me sometimes, but also like a lot of time it happens not in Asia, Asian people, a lot of time it happens, I see most of the white people, yeah. So it's an interesting phenomena that happened through the history, but also it still carries on in this 2021,
I think I can go next. Just to piggyback on what Mizin just said and what you just said, Brian. The word Asian is a construct, especially in the larger context of the United States. It's such a very interesting construct for me. Whenever I hear an Asian or an Asian American, for me, it makes things a little bit more harder and difficult as a community organizer. That word is very unique and challenging. I'll give you an example. For instance, in terms of migration, immigration, we really have to take a look at, the waves, the first, the second, that, there are several different waves that come to the United States. And when we lump all the Asian immigration in one, it really reduced the impact of each immigration and the importance of each immigration to the United States. Things like, the Asian American stereotypes and this moral minority myth, really played against the newer immigrant groups such as Burmese or Nepali, so it's really challenging for me when, all Asians are lumped together. And it's also very difficult, especially with the new Asian groups that are coming in, like Afghanis and Iraqis. They are Asians. They are Asians, and then even Bangladeshis, right? Like, so it's very important. It's very difficult for organizers to wrestle around that and create a broad-based coalition to counter against things like Asian hate. So I think lumping the word Asian is very challenging for me, but at the same time I also see as an important construct, because we can't change the sense. Most of the time, it's a census question, like whether you're Asian or but like I think it's important for us to as activists and as a community organizers capture the importance that there is no one Asian group. There is no such thing as like the Asian or the Asian American, but there are several Asian Americans. Understanding that will allow us to build much broader coalition and to engage in meaningful political dialogues in the United States.
Myung, would you like to go? I think you're muted, Myung.
All right. Am I here?
Yes, we have
this
you.
This is a Zoom existential question. All right.
Am I here? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
all
you
right.
are.
All right. I agree that anytime a designation or codification occurs, like Asian or Asian American, it's already becoming so entrenched or essentialized or reductive that it's no longer a pertinent term. So I think it is very important to both get traction on like whatever is helped by this categorization, Asian or Asian American, in terms of being legible and relevant to activist spaces. But I think it's very important that those of us who work in these activist spaces keep thinking of these ideas of Asian or Asian American as multiple or plural and complex, right? Rather than somehow singular or unified. So I think for me, the true honor and burden and grace of activism is how to carry forward the work of like legibility, right? Here we are as a certain community, but without making it so essentialized, right? So the kind of toggle between recognition, making our voices heard, as Mizin might suggest, and also making sure that our activism is inclusive of complexities. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the follow-up, which is another kind of open question for our panelists is how you identify with the label of American or Asian American. And I'll, regale you with a fun little tidbit that I became a citizen on the morning of January 6th. So, with that being said, right, as an immigrant who in a way came here by choice, there is some sort of confusion or difficulty with identifying as an American. In some ways, it implies a turning back on who I am or where I came from. But then on the other hand, I think that I'm like, well, I want to identify as American almost out of a sense of defiance, right? If you're saying that I don't belong here, I want to insist on that fact. So with that, I'm interested to hear how you all feel in relation to this, tricky concept. Yeah.
Well, I'm not American citizen. If I do it, I will have to give up my Korean citizenship. So I haven't really considered that I'm gonna give up my Korean citizenship and to get the American citizenship. But every time I go back to Korea, I do not no longer have the government insurance. So until like I deported, I came back to the country. So I want my insurance back. But it's weird. And when I come back here, I don't have to stand in the different line that where other travelers stand because I have the green card. And then I stand with my American husband next to it. So somehow it's weird that I'm not a citizen, but when I come back here, I feel like I am part of the group of the people who are born here, So I do have some kind of interesting experience. That's just personally, yeah.
And I'll take a jab here, Bryan. Again, the American. It also depends on where you're at in your professional or in your social life, right? Like those of us who have much better social and cultural capitals and more privileged in the United States, we're more proud Americans. That opportunities afforded to us, that came with that, little blue book, for instance, ability to do travels and present yourself, not from, the quote unquote third world country, but from the United States. It really helps a lot. It really helps reinforce, the ideal and, this beautiful version of Americanism. But there are also those of us who are struggling day and night, within the Burmese American groups. And if you go ask them if you are a proud American, they would answer the otherwise, So it really depends, like, who is this the word American is for? And at the end of the day, it all boils down to, for whom the bell tolls and where the wind is blowing, right? So I think it is very important for us to, again, digest and dissect this Americanism, the word American. But for instance, a lot of the Burmese who actually came here came to Buffalo or the United States, without knowing what really America was. They were forced out of the country. They fled because they really fear for their life, and not by choice but by chance and by unfortunate circumstances. They came here, and then if you ask them, they're not sure what American really is. So for me, I think I'm fortunate enough to have this citizenship because I have nowhere else to go. But at the same time, I think I'm also very cognizant of the fact that that privilege and opportunity that came with this word American is not for all quote unquote Burmese Americans.
For my part, I just wonder, Bryan and Barbara, whether I could maybe turn it back on you to sort of further this conversation. What for either of you or both of you is the significance or critical mass around asking this question about Asian American in terms of our panel tonight, or Barbara, the Babel programming around, Changnevi. So I would like to just perhaps throw it back to Bryan and Barbara, and either of you, both of you. What do you think is the sort of the critical mass around why you're asking this question about what it means to us as panelists about the question or condition of Asian American? Could you talk to us a little bit about that, either Bryan or Barbara?
Yeah, I think if I can go. And
okay, great.
Thank you for turning the tables. I think my sort of goal or question perhaps is a little bit basic in terms of just wanting to tease out the different strands of of this very convenient label, and illustrate that that there is not one
Sure.
there's not one singular identity, or right, just in the same way as there is not one kind of singular immigrant experience.
Sure.
And I think it connects to something that you actually brought up during your talk earlier, this idea of pluralities.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's where my kind of personal motivation comes from. But
Sure.
maybe I can turn it to Barbara.
Okay, great.
Now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Myung, for having sort of a meta move. I feel so much has already been said that I really want to highlight. I very much appreciate in Bryan's presentation his sort of directing us to be aware that violence against Asian communities goes back to the 1870s with the sort of influx of Chinese immigrants working on the railroad infrastructure. And if you look at American history, how much policy and actions from the Chinese Exclusion Act, Yellow Peril, the Japanese internment, the record of white Americans targeting, specifically trying to either exclude various Asian groups from this country, is a history that I think we really need to reckon with. And I was shocked to see in my research how much or how little Asian history is included as part of American history. So American history becomes sort of this whitewashed notion that it's sort of like white people's history. And then we maybe have a chapter on all immigrants, or we have a chapter on different groups. And so trying to problematize that and really shine a light on some of the darker moments of history. But at the same time, I very much appreciate you pointing out the notion of like wanting to make sure that artists and activist voices are heard, but not necessarily essentialized. And so also wanting to make sure so many of the authors that we've brought for the Babel series might be Afghani or Korean or Chinese, or from their ancestors are from a different homeland, but their work is not necessarily being asked to represent that racial ethnic identity, right? The artwork might address issues of assimilation or immigration or any of those sort of xenophobia, racism, but it's not a requirement. And wanting to not pigeonhole or put someone into a box to say that like white artists can address anything, and then women artists need to address women issues, and writers or artists from a certain racial ethnic identity need to address these sets of issues. I very much appreciated Mizin pointing out the sort of conflation of not just the stereotype as a Korean person, but this sort of presumption of either a certain social class or a certain gendered stereotype, and the degree to which that goes hand in hand, and that we can't just sift out one type of racial stereotyping, that how often those stereotypes overlap and become much more complex. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but it does lead me to one of my questions that I'd like to raise to the panel, which is just, I'm curious to know how you navigate the complexity of naming, and the sort of pressures or choice as to whether to take on an anglicized name, or how you make space for your given name. And I'm sort of wondering if you've noticed any changes over time in expectations towards names.
So when I was in early 20s, I went to Australia to have a kind of work visa, and then I can study English there. I think it's called a working holiday visa. Yeah. Anyway, when I was there, nobody could really spell my name or say my name correctly. So I tried to change my name to something that they can easily pronounce, pronunciate. But I gave up that idea because I was like, why should I adjust my name for their convenience, so I don't use that name at all. I just use my given name. I just changed the spelling because it just looks prettier. Instead of J, I just go with the Z, because when I put the Z, some people, I think, actually pronunciate my name more correctly. So I always try to keep my name, even though other people struggle, because this is my culture, and then this is my given name, and then my name actually means something. Like Mi means beauty, Jin means wisdom. So there is a meaning of my name, and then I want to keep that. I don't want to adjust it for other people's convenience. Yeah. So
I totally agree with what Mizin just said. It's really amazing that how a lot of the names have the real meaning in it. So the same thing with my name. It does have a meaning, and and it does represent, as I said before, the week of the day that I was born. So it's very a strong cultural root in it. But apart from it, one of the reasons why I kept my name even after my naturalization is because this is the only thing that I have with me, and this is something that I will be able to pass down to the future generation, if and when it comes. We're fighting very hard to keep our quote unquote home culture, the native culture, right, of our Burmese people, and we're already losing the ground. And so I'm just like trying my best to cling into what we have as Burmese as much as I can while I can. And so probably, in a hope that later I can explain that, this is what it means to be a Burmese person in Buffalo.
Bryan or Myung, did you want to talk about, it's not a requirement to talk to every question, but I want to make sure that we don't move on if you haven't had a chance to talk.
Yeah, we can move on. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe I'll go since in some ways I'm the outlier in this group, right? So my given name is Li Chengyang. It's a Chinese name, family name is Li. So in a way, I was always kind of annoyed by the fact that I had to turn my name upside down when I came here to fit with the kind of first name, last name. Typology, and invariably people will take my Chang to be my first name when more accurately it should be Yang, and so on. But I think I have a conflicted relationship with the name Bryan. So Bryan is not a name that I picked for myself. It reflects the fact that my family were converted Catholics, and so that was my baptismal name. So to me, and it's also a rather common practice, as some of you know, in Asia or some Asian countries, in Malaysia, for folks to have an English given name. And to me, it's a record of colonization. It's a record of kind of globalization, where we are kind of adopting certain practices that are spread, in large part due to things like American cultural hegemony and so on. But yeah, I think that's something that I'm not fully sure what it means, but I go by Bryan, I go by Cheng Yang. In some ways, it's also, for me, I guess, a way to maintain these separate identities, right? I can be Bryan in one sphere and, someone else in another.
Just want to quickly touch on that, Bryan. My parents and my grandparents, they all have an English name. They all have English names because of the because of the colonization. Burma was a British colony, so they retain the names until very late in their life. So you're right. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, given Myung's question to Bryan and me, number one, I just want to emphasize anybody who's out there and watching who would like to throw their question into the chat. We still have just a few minutes left, so please don't wait and then regret that you missed your chance. But I'm curious to know what each of you thinks is sort of like, what is the question that for you kind of drives your work, or what is the question that you feel like you keep circling around in your artwork and your activism, that you feel like this is the thing I keep grappling with? So it might not be a question with an answer, but it's one of those defining questions for you.
One thing I try to not do on purpose, actually, bringing my culture background into my art, because I don't want to be categorized as a Korean artist. I want to be just an artist, I don't want to brand myself as an Asian artist living in America, so that I don't have to highlight the culture of where I'm from, unless that's really something I want to talk about. Because mainly what I talk about in my artwork is that based on my experience as someone living in other culture, but also experiencing all the interconnection through the global connection. So I see more me as like one of the elements of our society, more than me, somebody from very specific race background. So I try to rebuild the interconnection and the interdependency between human. So that's something I try to do. But also these days, I don't think I actually have any very and specific answer, but maybe Young, maybe you can tell me. But in academia, there is a definitely kind of a kind of movement that they try to have the diverse group in the faculty. So they hire Asian women faculty more, or they try to hire more African American, or or more diverse races, for the kind of a political purpose. But sometimes I ask my question whenever I get some very grateful opportunities. I sometimes question, like, is it something because I'm Korean? Because I'm Asian woman? Is it why I'm getting some more advantage? Or is it something because I'm really important to be there, or I'm good at this kind of thing, so I'm invited? So there's always a kind of dilemma that I'm going through. More I develop my careers, I get that question, like I bring up that question to myself, I guess. Does it make sense? I think you're muted.
And I said wonderful things. No, sorry. Mizin, I understand your question implicitly, and I think it's a very relevant question. And whether, like, I see different permutations of that question for all of us. Like whether we're identified too narrowly, like I matter because I'm X, Y, or Z. People are paying attention to me because I fit some sort of profile. I mean, this is a staggering problem, right? And at the same time, those of us who are on the activist front, I see why naming matters. Like, we're working on behalf of this community or that community. But I think for me, the question is, how can we keep that turbulence and that friction alive? The reason why it's important to name how we serve a community. This is who we want to connect with. And then the more sort of fraught question at the same time of, because I'm named, is that a problem? Is that a way in which actually I'm just like being picked because of my essentialized reductive sense of I'm Korean, whatever, fill in the blank. I think this is a struggle. That's a valuable struggle. And that's what activism means, that we don't fall into either an essentializing category, and to honor naming, I mean, to follow on Barbara's question, and at the same time, not to fall victim to this kind of like tight, categorized, defining way of, I am Burmese, I am Chinese, I'm an immigrant from Korea, not to be defined by those categories. I think that's really the struggle, right? Barbara, I'm gonna return it to you to see if I'm making any sense.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful for the wisdom and for articulating so much more succinctly what I was trying to say, which is, I think, so much at the heart of the Babel series. The series was created in the post 9/11 moment. My predecessor, Mike Kelleher, recognized that we were America, a country at war. And you could go about your daily life without really recognizing or realizing that we were a country at war, and that war was being driven by severe xenophobia. And when Viet Thanh Nguyen was here a few years ago for Babel, he mentioned that every war going back for a century had been fought against Asian communities. And you could sort of audibly hear a little bit of a gasp in the audience, that was something that many people had not thought of in those terms, that too often I think we're taught to think of the Korean War, World War II, as like separate military operations or separate projects for freedom. And also that there had not been a full grappling with the degree to which Persian Gulf I and the Iraq War included xenophobia and racism and war against Asian communities. So I think that your point that there needs to be this constant turbulence and friction, to use your words, and that these are very fraught questions. But I feel very much a responsibility to keep bringing up that friction and turbulence, and to not allow us to slip into feeling like these are questions that only pertain to certain members of American culture, or that some people need to think about this, but not everybody needs to think about it. And to feel that there is a shared responsibility to hearing each other's stories and understanding where do we each as individuals fall into this conversation. I'm very aware that tonight's conversation, that we took Mizin's work as sort of the title, Spoken and Seen, and I've thought so much about what that means, to be spoken, to be seen, and I wonder if in closing, if anyone wants to just reflect on what that means to you, to be spoken and seen.
So for, very new immigrant group like Burmese, for instance, again, that Burmese X, right? Being able to be seen and, be spoken about us is extremely important and critical for our existence. Because, the community is very young, and without that aspect, we'll have no space. So it is extremely important for us to be seen and spoken.
Wonderful.
Anybody else?
Oh yeah, Zoom is so weird because if I were in person, you'd see Lynn, that my face was grinning very broadly. I support you. I think what you had to say is so profoundly moving. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think maybe if I can add something, obviously I wish we could have this conversation for another hour. There's so many strands that I would love to continue to tease out, but I'm going to return to something that you said, Myung, mentioning, arts and activisms as plural, and something that you brought up, Mizin, as like that each one of these posters is representative of one small action. I must confess that personally, I can feel very cynical about art and activism. In many ways, it really takes a leap of faith to want to believe that organizing or creating can actually affect the world outside of our conception. And so this idea that it really does take repetition, I think, is so beautiful about this printmaking, right? You're talking about repetition and this idea of dissemination, and to be able to kind of keep carrying that forward as a continual act, and not just one campaign, one exhibition,
Absolutely,
or one conversation, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's beautiful.
There was a time that I was hesitant to share this campaign as one of my art project, because I'm the member of this community, and then the campaign started for, support purpose. But as an artist, having an art exhibition is a privileged opportunity that I can get as for artists. To be honest, not every artist will have a solo exhibition. But when Western New York Book Art Center and I talked about having an exhibition with this campaign, there was a moment that I kind of do I want to? Because I don't want to take the advantage as an artist, with this campaign. I don't want this campaign becomes a commodity in art. But the truth is, because I did the exhibition, more people could see the work, and then there's more people now talk about the work, and then therefore the words are spreading. And then now Barbara saw the exhibition actually, and then approached them to me for this great talk tonight. So now I finally feel comfortable enough to have more art exhibitions with this campaign. So good news, I have 2 more art exhibitions with this campaign in other place, not only in just Western New York. So this message will be spreaded all over the country. Yeah.
Well, I agree so much that we could keep the conversation going, and my hope is that this will not be the end of conversations like this, but I am aware that we are out of time. I just want to honor the candor of our 3 panelists, your openness with sharing your work and sharing your story, and being willing to really be quite vulnerable tonight, from talking about fear and hesitation. And I sympathize very much, Bryan, with your sense of feeling like sometimes it just takes such a leap of faith to believe. But I, for one, feel so moved and inspired by each of you for sharing your stories. And I believe that each of these moments does affect change, and that we can keep believing that, and keep moving forward and keep doing it, keep speaking, keep being seen, keep shining a spotlight on each other and the work that all of you are doing. So thank you so much for participating tonight to our panel. Thank you everyone who tuned in, for letting us know where you're coming from. And please go to the various websites that we shared tonight, justbuffalo.org, NYIC, and to check out more of what we're doing and what each of our artists and panelists are doing. You can go to justbuffalo.org to find out more. And thank you so much, everyone. We hope to see you next week at Chiang Rai Lee at Babel. Good night.